Good morning, everyone. I will call to order the July 13, 2022 Housing Authority of Clackamas County Board of Directors meeting. Gary, would you please call the roll?
Yes, thank you, Chair. First, our staff support today, Stephen Madcourt, County Counsel, Tony Mayernick, Clerk to the Board. You are meeting as a Housing Authority Board. Therefore, I'll introduce starting Housing Commissioner Leenstra.
Hello?
Are you here? Yes, you're here, Commissioner Leenstra, yes?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Savas?
Present.
Commissioner Schrader?
Here.
Commissioner Fisher?
Here.
Commissioner Shull?
Here.
Chair Smith?
Here. We are holding this meeting in person and virtually. If you've joined us via Zoom for this meeting and are interested in providing public comment, we will prompt you regarding how to do that when the time is right. I would like to remind all participants, including staff, all elected officials, and members of the public that Robert's Rules of Order will be enforced in this public hearing. We welcome your opinions and look forward to your polite participation. Gary, would you please introduce the first item?
Yes, Chair Smith, this is a public hearing, and the hearing is regarding the Housing Authority of Clackamas County moving to work plan and application for the asset building cohort. Rod Cook is the Director of Health, Housing, and Human Services at Clackamas County. Tony Carter is the Interim Executive Director of the Housing Authority. Go ahead, please.
Yes, and in lieu of time, I'll turn this over to Tony Carter, who's here to give you a few brief comments.
Good morning, Commissioners. We are here today to allow our board, our clients, and the community at large the opportunity to give comments on our Moving to Work action plan. Moving to Work is a HUD program that was created by Congress in 1996 with 3 statutory objectives: increase cost effectiveness, increase opportunities for self-sufficiency, and increase housing choice. Initially, only 39 agencies were selected to try to improve operations to meet these goals. These agencies were studied and found to be so successful and innovative that in 2016, Congress authorized HUD to add 100 more Moving to Work agencies through 4 separate opportunities called cohorts. Each cohort had very specific goals that the Housing Authority had to work towards. The first 3 cohorts have already been selected, and applications for the 4th and final cohort are due July 28th. This 4th cohort was an obvious choice for Clackamas County to apply, as it aligns so well with our annual plan goals and our development strategic objectives. The asset building cohort for which we are applying allows us to test initiatives and activities that will encourage self-sufficiency in perfect timing with our disposition of public housing scattered sites. Without Move to Work, due to the significant increases in housing costs, the Housing Authority faces the prospect of reducing the number of households it serves with its limited budget. That is exactly why Move to Work is needed. It will give the Housing Authority additional tools known as waivers to reduce costs of operation and allow us to shift this savings towards helping families become more self-sufficient. I could give you at least 20 waiver options that already exist that could lead to cost savings if we get Move to Work status. And I want to give you a couple examples so you understand how they'll get cost savings that we will then apply to our new Move to Work plan. HACC could go from a full recertification of a family every year to only doing recertifications every 3 years. That is a huge savings in administrative costs and paperwork for both tenants and staff. The Housing Authority could allow self-certification of assets up to $50,000, which reduces paperwork processing since now the limit is $5,000. The Housing Authority could inspect all its own properties, which would save the Housing Authority approximately $150 per unit, as we currently have to hire a third-party property inspector. The Housing Authority could elect to go to biennial inspections to triennial inspections, which would also reduce the cost of inspections. And the Housing Authority could elect to create a new short-term housing assistance program with supportive housing services that is currently not allowed, as all our assistance is deemed long-term and can be tied to a family for the duration of their life. If awarded Move to Work, we would be presenting waivers to this board and the residents we serve for consideration and approval as we grow our program. In short, the benefits of Move to Work and the flexibilities they provide would reduce administrative burden costs and allow us to shift our resources from paper pushing and verifying activities to directly improving our tenants' skills, helping them gain employment and work towards self-sufficiency as our focus, not just giving them affordable housing. So I'd like to go over very quickly. We hope to end the cycle of poverty by doing this Move to Work plan. The plan focuses on combining both a savings account component and a credit reporting component for participating households. The savings account component will work with households currently served in our programs who are interested in home ownership to establish a savings account and learn about home ownership. As part of the participation in the program, the Housing Authority will contribute to each participant's savings account monthly up to 25% of the household's current rent portion. The second component is the credit reporting component, and HACC will expand on its existing and successful credit reporting program through outreach and partnerships with property owners, utility companies, and others throughout the community. This program will help renters establish improved credit scores by reporting rent and utility payments to the Credit Bureau. The Move to Work process has very strict criteria to be considered by HUD. We must have a public review period of 30 days, which we are complying with as we notified residents and the public of the Move to Work application and made it available to review on our website since June 13th. We must conduct this public hearing and incorporate comments into the plan before submitting to HUD. We must get board consent to submit our application with a signed resolution by July 28th, and we must submit our application to HUD by no later than 9 p.m. on July 28th. That concludes my presentation, and I'll allow time for questions and comments.
Thank you, Tony, very much. We do have some questions. Commissioner Schrader.
Yeah, actually, this sounds like a great program, and it fits in with some of the work actually we've been already doing at the national level to move people into housing ownership away from generational poverty. But there are other components to that as well. So this seems to focus solely on the, the credit piece, the, savings piece. How does it, is there any nexus with workforce and our workforce system in terms of employment? Or is it pretty much just sticking to financial literacy?
So we
if I could
have
say
what's called a family self-sufficiency program already, and we successfully have grown it from one coordinator to two and are trying to, we're going to continue to grow that. When we add participants from the Move to Work program, the asset building one, we can also enroll them in FSS, and the more people you enroll in FSS, the more employees you can hire and get more grant money for that program.
I'm sorry, what's FSS?
Family Self-Sufficiency Program, and that
Okay,
works
good.
on the workforce side. That
Okay.
is the employment side of it. So you kind of use this program to build this program and have them work together.
So is there a direct nexus to workforce?
Yes, the
okay.
Family Self-Sufficiency Program works directly with the Workforce Program. We have a IGA.
That is obtaining employment, getting access to job interviews, the whole notion
Yes,
of,
resume building.
Resume,
yes.
all of that. Mm-hmm.
Education. We work with Clackamas Community College as well through that program.
yeah, it's probably contracted through the Clackamas Workforce. Okay.
It is.
Sounds like a great program, and I would suspect at the national level, we have supported this move forward. I haven't looked at all the information yet from the Prosperity Initiative that we're working on nationally, but I'm sure this is part of it, and I'll double check that. But it sounds great. Wow. Okay.
Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Smith. I appreciate this opportunity. I have two questions, so I'll just ask them both, and then you can just answer. My first is, if you could just give an overview of, since this has been a program since 1996, why we're applying or trying to move to work now. That's my first question. And then I'm wondering if you can expand a bit on the savings component. I heard you say that 25% of the value of the residents' rental contribution, we would put that into the savings account. I'm interested to know what the individual can put in the account and if there are any there's always these ceilings of how much people can save and then still qualify for
Yeah.
public assistance. I'm wondering if there's any ceilings, and then how practically that savings is translated into housing purchase.
Multi-part question. I don't know if I got it all. so make sure.
First part is why now?
Why now? Okay, so the Housing Authority didn't qualify when they originally did the 39. They chose all large housing authorities. So it was like the Home Forwards and the King Counties, very large housing authorities were the original 39. They wanted to do a study to make sure that these waivers and make sure that they were still serving the same number of people or more by doing all these special programs. And they did prove that. So the 100 that they initially said they would allow to further go on, some of those were only small housing authorities. They wanted to give rural, smaller housing authorities opportunities. So for those cohorts, we couldn't even apply. The other two were for middle-sized, that's what we are, a middle-sized housing authority. And the first one that they had open was a tiered rent study kind of one, and we kind of looked at it, and it didn't look like it fit our county very well, but we knew this cohort was coming out, but they made it the final cohort, and this one seemed to be a better fit for where we were going with our strategic direction, so that's why now.
Okay, so just to summarize, it hasn't been a good fit up until now to apply.
Correct.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, next answer.
Thank
Next
you,
answer.
Commissioner Fisher. Commissioner
Oh,
Scholl?
wait, she didn't answer the second
I'm
part of the
sorry,
question. That's okay.
Funding work, like if they're putting money towards the.
Okay, so the funding. So like our family self-sufficiency program, there's a special program that's called an escrow account. It's an account that we keep for the tenant, and it doesn't count against their income because they don't have access to it unless they meet their goals that they set up and unless it is one of their goals that they're spending it on. So let's say their goal is they want to buy a new computer to go to school. We can pay for tuition and computer then, but they can't pay for groceries and medical bills out of that escrow account. It's not disposable income to them, so we don't count it as disposable income to them. And so therefore, it doesn't cap out and make them ineligible if
Okay,
they
is
build
that where the contribution is going of the 25%?
Yes, we're calling it a savings account, though, not an escrow account for
But
them.
it has the same no limit. And then, okay, so there's no cap. Okay, I think that's it. That's what I wanted to know. Thank you. Oh, and can they contribute their own resources to that account?
Absolutely.
Okay. And even what about if a family member wanted to put money in that account?
Absolutely. We're also, there are 3 actual different options we're going to have. If they sign up for FSS, they'll have the escrow account. We're going to set up the savings account. And then there's also, we have a limited number of families that can sign up for the IDA program.
The I
Individual
what?
development accounts, IDA. So we're going to encourage them to sign up for all 3 to get the most savings built up for home ownership.
And Commissioner, if I could say, the key part for me would be it's habit forming. You know, it's teaching them to have a savings and to look towards how they're going to get there. Because if you don't put that into their psyche, it'll never happen. So that's the other part. That's the win, the other win on this type of project. So.
Thank you.
Finish, Commissioner Fisher. Thank you very much, Commissioner Scholl.
Yeah, well, that answered a couple of my questions. So when we look at ending the cycle of poverty, you've mentioned that you control the account. At what point in time would the potential homeowner receive that money? And in what kind of criteria would they have to meet at that time in terms of being ready to maintain a home, maintain a mortgage, hold a job, et cetera? What are the criteria for success at that point, that the money's transferred to the potential homeowner?
So we haven't ironed out all the minutia of the details, but I think we would do it similar to our family self-sufficiency program. What the family does is they sit with the person who's working with them on their homeownership program, and they fill out a participation agreement. And in that participation agreement, they set out goals for the family. They have to meet all of those goals which can be to find stable employment, to find employment that can allow them to have X amount of money per month to put towards housing. And they would have each of those goals set up, and until they've met all those goals, they would not have access to their account, and they would not, the money would not be released. So we wouldn't be having someone who has $100,000 buy a house and quit their job. That they would have to have maintained employment and have that participation agreement signed. It's a contract we have with the tenant and the housing authority.
Okay, one more question, and I think everybody in the county would like to be in a program where they could receive money to go towards a potential purchase of a home. What's the process for selecting the people who would be included in this program and those who would not be?
So it would be limited to those we serve already, so participants we already have. And we've already done a survey of families. They have to be motivated, able to work, and they have to want to own a home. So they have to kind of meet that threshold criteria first. We did a survey of all of our public housing and Section 8 tenants and only found about 30 that were strongly ready to do this. There were additionals that were ready to do this, but they weren't as strong a candidate. And we have some criteria we're basing that on, based upon their ability to work. But at this time, it's limited to our participants that come off our wait list.
Okay, and one last question. If the housing authority puts money into the account and the individual puts money into the account, at what point in time in the future is there a deadline on being at a position to be able to buy a home? Does this account go on forever? And what happens at some time in the future, say 10, 15 years down the road, when the individual still is not in a position to buy a home? What happens to the account then?
So my guess is we're going to build it just like the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. It does have a deadline. You have to meet your goals within 5 years. If you don't meet your goals within 5 years, the portion we contributed goes back into our housing assistance pool. It just becomes money that we give out for housing assistance. They don't get that money. It's taken back. They will get to keep their portion that they saved, but they won't get our portion.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, it's got a few questions, but a really basic question is, what's the meaning of moving to work? What does that, how's that play out? What was the intention of that wording?
The intention is to get them to move off assistance and to working stably and graduating off
Okay,
assistance.
Okay, thank you. I assumed that, but I wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
So, and I know I need help with this. I think I'm asking, my memory was that years ago, when we had whatever the base rate was for a certain type of housing for the cost per month, we increased that because of the cost of housing, the cost of living. And I asked staff then, I asked myself too, is that, we're trying to help these folks, so why would we actually raise that amount and increase their cost? And I know that portion of that was federal, that we get a little bit more federal assistance, but also it did raise their contribution to their monthly rent, as I understood. That's my recollection from several years back. So if it was $900, let's just say, I remember it was 30% or 60%, but if it was $900 and we raised it to $1,100, okay, to be, more in line with the current market, that just seem counterintuitive? So can you help me with that? So I have a question that follows on that based on your answer.
I think you're talking about our payment standards of what we'll pay towards rent. And honestly, in order to even find a unit, you have to prove that you can afford it. And so if our payment standards aren't high enough that they could afford a unit, they couldn't even find a unit. So you have to increase your payment standards with market to match market. And the payment standard portion allows us to keep the tenant rent portion at the lowest possible. So when they initially move in, the maximum they can pay out of pocket is 40% of income. We like to keep it more at 30% so that they have money for groceries and medical bills. So you have to continually increase the payment standards. Luckily for us, we were successful in doing a market analysis and presenting that to HUD to get additional funding every time we've increased our payment standards. So we've gotten the matching federal funds for those increases. That's not always the case. Oftentimes, they fall behind the market by 10% or more. So increasing the payment standard allows clients to find housing where they need to find it and get their foot in the door. And then it also keeps their portion of the rent down.
Okay, so thank you for that. The follow-up question based on that answer is, well, when I asked the question, the other answer I had years ago when we did this, we raised that. Again, I thought it was counterintuitive because that I just might be more of a burden to those people that we're trying to help here. And you've clarified that. I was also told that extra income, whether it came from the federal side or that assistance came from the federal side, was also used to leverage more, build more housing and units, and then the bottom line for the HACC, that it was a revenue source. Is that correct? So basically our motivation was not only to help the individuals, but, well, really to help the financial health of the HACC to
So then
provide more housing.
Right, you're talking about the project-based voucher rent assistance amounts, those payment standards, and those help support the affordable housing projects by making them able to run and charge the tenant less money, but able to cover the maintenance and administrative costs of those properties.
And these people that are eligible for this program that we're talking about, they're receiving a voucher, correct?
Correct,
Correct, right, so it's all the same thing.
correct.
So, in essence, that it was an opportunity to generate revenue for the program, for the
Correct.
HACC program, to expand housing. So, in essence, by getting back to the final piece of this, if that's the case, then are we undermining to some degree our ability with these funds, our ability to actually build those extra units? Because we're freeing up money, right? And so my question is this totally directed towards the staff time savings of 1 year to 3 years? Or is this, my last point, which is,
I'm not taking, I'm not.
Will it undermine our revenue generation aspect?
So the goal of using Move to Work is not to take from the development pool. The goal is to save so much money in your administrative changes that you're using that savings to help those families. That's the money that's going into those accounts. It's not touching the normal operations.
All right, so is there any compromise, when you say the inspections, going from 1 year to 3 years, what are those inspections? Are we compromising maybe the welfare, the health of the building, or the health or welfare of the individual living there, residing? I'm just kind of wondering what we're compromising.
So individual landlords, even in their own properties, should be inspecting their properties. They should have a standard, and they should be giving notices to their tenants if they're not keeping up their property. We're not the police of that. What we go in for is more to protect the tenant and make sure the landlord is keeping the property to our standards. And our standards are a bare minimum housing quality standard. I would think if you saw our public housing and some of the Section 8 units we're using, it's not that we're requiring excessive upkeep, we're just requiring them to keep a bare minimum. So by limiting the inspections, we're just reducing our policing role and putting that role back on the owner of the property.
Right, well, thank you. My concern, of course, is some of the housing stock we have is in, I won't say disrepair, but it's really tired, and we need to improve those living conditions. That was just a concern I had.
Yeah. It wouldn't reduce the public housing side of it.
Okay.
It affects the Section 8 side, where it's the private market landlord.
Okay, thank you.
Finished, Commissioner Salas?
I am, thank you.
This is a good program. I appreciate the effort that we're trying to help people to buy homes. And if I've had any angst about all the public housing that we're doing, it's focused on one particular cohort where tens, if not hundreds of $millions is going to a program for homeless or people with disparities, and we're not looking at the other side of the equation on this. Also, I'm concerned, as everybody is, the affordability of homes because prices have increased so much. So are the people in this program, can they go out and, for instance, partner with, let's say, Habitat for Humanity and build their homes? Because Habitat Humanity, I was talking to a neighboring jurisdiction, and what they're considering in their locale is they have a piece of land, and they want to bring in Habitat for Humanity and build many houses on that. And in that investment, the investment would be 65-35, for instance. Habitat Humanity would retain 35% of the investment. The buyer of the home would have 65% of the investment, and their payments would be based on 65% of the overall value of the home, therefore lowering their payment to make it affordable for them to live in. Let's say they hold on to the home for 10, 20, 30 years. At the end of the 30 years, they can sell it or when the mortgage is paid off, but they would retain their 65%, and then 35% would go back to Habitat for Humanity. I know that in this county, land is scarce to do that. But I think it's a program that's worthy. What's your feelings on that, your thoughts?
I definitely think that the application that we set up is very bare bones. There's a lot of structure that needs to be done if we are selected, and that is definitely something we can look into. And I've written that down. That's an excellent.
You're not excluding anything.
No, not at all. That's why you do a very basic plan to HUD, and then it allows you to build off of that from there.
Great. That is wonderful. Very good. I am now going to open the meeting for public testimony. I will take the in-person testimony first. Is there anybody in the room who wishes to testify on this matter? Seeing no one. Tony, do we have anybody on Zoom who would like to testify?
At this time, if there is anyone who would like to offer public comment, please use the raise hand feature, and I will call on you in the order received. Madam Chair, I do not have any hands raised.
Thank you, Tony. I will now close the public hearing and ask if there's any further discussion. Commissioner Scholl.
One of the comments from constituents on a program like this is that they wonder if the program will actually save money. In other words, can you tell us that this program will actually save the taxpayer money over time? And let me add something here. The idea of providing rental assistance for decades is expensive. So will this program potentially reduce the overall cost to the taxpayer for supportive housing?
The short answer is no. The program is to be a, how would you say it? Bridge. We would be helping more families. I mean, in the perfect ideal world, you'd get all the way through your wait list and nobody needed help, and then yes, we could get rid of this program, but I don't see that happening. What this program does do is the cost savings we do with our administrative cost savings makes it a no-cost program, because we're trying to cut corners on administration and save that money to use to build this new program. So it's not costing taxpayers more, but it won't be saving money because we are going to continue to help families.
But for those families who, at the end of 5 years, are able to use this money to purchase a home and be self-sufficient, at that point in time, there would be no more requirement for tax dollars to support their housing.
To support them, but we'll pull another family off the wait
Yeah,
list to help
okay.
them.
Well, but,
Yeah.
okay, so that's so if somebody asks, that's a positive thing I can tell them.
Yes, it is.
Okay,
They're
good,
graduating
thank you.
off assistance. We're actually moving people on.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Finished, Commissioner Scholl?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I will now entertain a motion.
Chair, I move we direct staff to submit the final moving to work plan and application as a consent agenda request for the July 28th, 2022 business meeting.
Second.
A motion has been made by Commissioner Savas to direct staff to submit the final moving to work plan and application, and it has been seconded by Commissioner Schrader. Any further discussion? Seeing none, Tony, please call the poll.
Commissioner Leenstra? Aye. Commissioner Fisher?
Aye.
Commissioner Scholl?
Aye.
Commissioner Schrader?
Aye.
Commissioner Savas?
Aye.
Chair Smith?
Aye. Thank you very much, everyone. Motion passes 6-0. Go forth and be prosperous. Thank you, Ann Leenstra, for being a part of this today. Your participation is very valued.
Thank you.
Gary, what's up next?
So please adjourn as the Housing Board and then convene as the Board of County Commissioners, Chair.
I will now recess as a Housing Authority of Clackamas County and reconvene as a Board of County Commissioners.
All right, Commissioners, this is a policy session next. It is file ZDO-283, fiscal year 2022, minor and time-sensitive comprehensive plan and ZDO amendments. Our presenters today are Jennifer Hughes, Planning Director, and Glenn Hamburg, Senior Planner, both from the Planning and Zoning Division of Transportation and Development. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Gary. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Jennifer Hughes. I'm the County Planning Director. With me is Senior Planner Glenn Hamburg, and we are here today to talk to you about our minor and time-sensitive amendments package. You have, I think, all heard me refer to this somewhat affectionately as the good government package. That is our goal with these minor amendments, where we are attempting to address code issues, essentially code maintenance issues, situations where we're out of sync with state law in some cases, places where we need to clarify existing language. It also does allow an avenue for us to make what we would call minor changes that are optional, that are less code maintenance and more about maybe a good idea that someone has had. Sometimes that's from the public, sometimes that's from you. Sometimes it's something that staff has identified as a change that could be beneficial. We really have put a lens on this year of bureaucratic streamlining, of efficiency. We are conscious, as a general funded program in part, that we need to be streamlined in our operations where we can be. And so some of the things that are identified, particularly on attachment A, which was that sort of laundry list of really minor things that's attached to your main study session worksheet, those are really focused on trying to eliminate process where we can, sort of bureaucratic redundancy where we can, without actually making substantive changes. And we're happy to talk to you about any of those if you have questions on them today, but we're really going to focus on the 5 issues that are called out in the staff report. And those do address, in some cases, in several cases, things that have come to us from the public where you may or may not agree that they are good ideas, but we are bringing them forward for you to consider, and we'll offer some analysis as to what the policy implication is and why it might be good or bad from your perspective. I think we have kind of a couple options on format today, and I wanted to defer to you, Chair, on how you'd like to handle this. We have 5. Glenn has slides on each one. We can go through them one at a time and have you speak to each one, or we can do it all at the end. And of course, I am conscious of time. We have an hour, so we would need to kind of monitor that, but it's up to you what your preference is.
Glenn, why don't you go through each one's slides, go through them. We have copies of the slides in our packet also. So if you could be brief in your description of each, and then Commissioners, at the end of each slide deck, I'll open it up to comments or questions. How's that?
That sounds good.
So after each issue is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Perfect. And I wanted to just say, we're just going to lead with the staff recommendation that we are recommending that you move all of the items forward for public hearing. Again, that does not mean that you are making a decision today to adopt any of these changes. It's simply referring it so that staff will do public notice. There will be a hearing at the Planning Commission, and then it would come before you in a public hearing before any of these things took effect.
And would
So-
the BCC, Gary, have 2 public hearings on this?
It would just be 1, correct?
Just 1, okay.
Correct, yes. And then you adopt the written order later at a business meeting.
Okay, continue.
Okay, thanks.
Good morning, Glenn Hamburg, Senior Planner. The first issue up is about public restrooms, specifically up in the Mount Hood area. The reason we're bringing this to you is that there has been some interest among members of the public in having what I'm going to call a standalone public restroom facility, things like these in the photos, in a particular commercial zone that's only up in the Mount Hood area. A hurdle that this idea has run into is that the zoning code doesn't expressly allow it in this zone, the rural tourist commercial district. So we are proposing to create a pathway in the zoning code where a standalone public restroom could be considered on a case-by-case basis according to existing public processes and according to existing criteria. This RTC district, I'm just going to have some maps to show you briefly, would be these pink areas in various pockets of the Mount Hood corridor. So for example, here in the Wemy-Welches area along Highway 26, a central location in Rhododendron, and then various spots in the government camp area. So this is the area that we're talking about, and we're proposing to allow this use as a conditional use. And as some of you might be familiar, the conditional use permit process considers the suitability of the specific property where it's proposed, the characteristics of the surrounding area and applicable comprehensive plan policies. It involves a public hearing. So it wouldn't be staff approving a standalone public restroom over the counter. That's the issue.
So are you saying each public restroom in each of these locales would have their own public hearing?
Each proposed public restroom would require a conditional use permit application that would have its own public hearing. So anytime somebody wanted to propose this type of thing in this area.
That seems very lengthy. Go ahead. Go ahead and finish your presentation.
Yeah, the benefit, it is lengthy, that's fair. The benefit to the conditional use permit process is it allows the public to weigh in on a specific project and to comment on, maybe even the structure's compatibility with the design standards of the Mount Hood area. Maybe a public restroom facility is good in one location, but not next door to some particular use that's out there. So that might be the benefit.
Okay. Have you finished with your presentation on this? We have a few questions in the queue. Because we're allowing this use, does it necessarily mean it will happen? And who will be building these restroom facilities?
So it doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. I do think that potentially Commissioner Savas may have some comments about a specific potential for one of these. The government camp community has expressed some interest, and there's been this sort of Oregon Solutions project going on that I'm not completely familiar with, but I'm peripherally familiar with. So yeah, there's a group of, I guess I would describe it as sort of business and community interests in government camp that would like to see a facility like this.
Good.
We haven't had a big outcry. Somebody's got to fund it. It certainly doesn't mean the county is obligating ourselves to fund public restrooms. If you ever wanted to, this would be available to us the same way it would be to anyone else, but there's
So you
nothing
call them
like that.
public restrooms, but then what would be the maintenance and care of them?
Whoever owns it,
Okay,
or
I
whatever
see.
arrangement they come
Got
up
it.
with, correct.
Thank you. Commissioner Savas, you're up.
I just want to thank staff, commend staff for trying to navigate this. We had this land use stuff is very complex, and we had a piece of property which, up at the mountain, and other places where, in this zone, you're really not allowed to do this. And so this, again, as Jennifer and staff here have described, allows that conditional use process. Economically, it's not practical for anyone really to do that unless there's a means to pay for a facility. We don't need to worry about that here. This is simply the land use aspect where it can be allowed under these conditions if there's someone willing to pay that, whether it's ODOT or it's a parks district or it's whatever it may be in the future. So I just want to thank staff for putting this together and solving that wicked, complex problem, and this will help that Oregon Solutions problem up there up at the mountain.
Great, wonderful. Any further comments on this particular, Commissioner Scholl?
Yeah, I support this. This is very much needed. Glad to see it on here.
Yep, I support it as well. So we're going to move on to number 2.
Very good. This next issue is, just to boil it down, the county is more restrictive than state law allows on one particular pathway for allowing new residential land uses in the county's forest lands. And the context is that in recent years, we have endeavored to be no more restrictive on land uses than the state requires us to be. However, these existing rules have been on the books for decades, and while changing the rules could increase property owner rights, the opportunity to do more with your property if you own forest lands, there might be some implications of that. This pathway that I'm referring to is this template test methodology. I could say a lot about it, but broadly, it's an analysis of whether a subject property where somebody might want to put a home is in an area that is already so developed that it's essentially maybe not usable to the timber industry or is just more appropriate for residential development. So they call it a template because we put a template centered on the property. We figure out how many parcels, how many lots are within that template, how many houses are on those properties, and then by our existing rules, we exclude certain properties of a certain size. And the various standards that we have exceed the standards that the state requires us to have. So in a sense, we are potentially disallowing a new residential use on a forest land property when we don't necessarily have to. So I mentioned that we've had these criteria for a long time, since the 90s. If we were to change them to relax the standards, more properties could qualify. It's just we have no idea, and we couldn't figure out how many more, because we evaluate them case by case as they come in. But we're confident more properties would qualify potentially. Now, there are concerns about new residential land uses in forest lands. A lot of them you can imagine. The Planning Commission expressed some wildfire concerns, preservation of lands for timber practices, those kinds of things. However, as I mentioned, the county has had a general practice of not being more restrictive than we have to be. So these are the trade-offs. Staff is recommending we at least propose reducing the standards and going through that public process, but interested in what you have to share.
Commissioner Fisher.
Yes, so I'm interested in understanding, was there a reason in the 90s that Clackamas County decided to be more restrictive, or did the state regulations ease over time?
The state regulations have not eased. I went into the records to see if I could find in meeting minutes why they decided this. I couldn't find anything. Our best guess is just back in the 90s when template tests became a thing, there might have just been more concern for residential development here locally out in timberlands. But there's nothing I could find.
Okay, and then I'm just curious as a follow-up, given the climate change and the risk of wildfire, is it wise to allow more development in timber zones, or is it more prudent to keep what we have currently? I mean, maybe the state regulations haven't caught up with the reality of the risk of wildfire.
Yeah, that's a policy question. And I don't know, not being able to quantify how many properties would qualify. It's a hard thing for us to estimate. I should add, though, that any new dwelling that is approved pursuant to this methodology has to meet certain fire siting standards. So these are conditions on the maintenance of vegetation around the home, the construction of the home itself. So there are some wildfire protections on there, but it's just a balance of those different interests.
And I'll maybe add, Senate Bill 762, that is, the state is now implementing, or they're in the process of implementing. Different agencies are charged with implementing different parts of it. This was the big sort of wildfire bill, right, following the terrible fires from 2 years ago. So we are anticipating, first of all, there are going to be there already sort of are, but there are going to be new defensible space requirements from the Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office implemented through them. There are going to be new wildfire hardening requirements for new construction under the building code. And then we anticipate something coming for land use, but none of that has been specified yet. That's a little bit farther out. So I think the state is very conscious of this issue. I just don't know if it will be approached from a perspective of limiting development as opposed to more this, what development is out there needs to be more resilient. So that will be unfolding over the next year or so.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Commissioner Fisher? Are you finished? Yes. Okay, Commissioner Scholl?
Yes, you just answered my question about the Planning Commission's recommendation not to move forward with this. I support just about any idea that will give Clackamas landowners the opportunity to utilize their property to the maximum extent that they wish to do so. But could you tell us a little bit about, you have on here, property soil productivity, how that is going to be determined, who determines that, And is that going to be an issue on this alignment of county requirements?
So that's a great question. There is a chart and there is a map of soil productivity. Basically, there's a regulatory map that determines in some science that the soils on a given property are capable of producing X number of cubic feet of wood fiber per year. If you have a property with higher productivity capability based on the soils, the standard for how much development there must be around you for your property to qualify increases. And so if you have a property that is really good at growing timber, there has to be more parcelization and development around you for you to get a house. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Commissioner Savas, and then I'll follow up with some questions.
Yeah, I'm supportive of this, but possibly with one little concern, I guess, or not really a concern, I don't know. But you mentioned soils, and I couldn't help but think about zigzag and the issues we've had with the river erosion and so forth. And I don't know how much of that where this would be subject to, right? This change would be subject to. And so is there, because of those unique soils up there, is there an opportunity to have a provision that might make that, keep that as it is? Because we're obviously concerned about that area and that, the flooding, yeah, it's flooding, it's not technically flooding, it's really weird. They don't call it flooding because the river river rise isn't the problem, it's actually the erosion of the soils nearby that cause essentially houses to be lost simply because the river changes course.
Right. So the channel migration, I think the channel migration zone, right?
That's the word I was
Is that the
looking
one
for,
we're talking
channel
about?
migration,
Okay.
yeah.
I wanted to make sure that I was thinking the same thing you were thinking. I think the short answer is yes, you could limit this any way you want. I mean, there's nothing that prevents us from we currently have a higher standard. We could continue to maintain a higher standard than the state geographically. Makes it a little harder to administer. We would want to tie it to a particular map. The only complicating factor, I guess, is the channel migration zone isn't something that's been adopted from a regulatory standpoint. But we certainly have the maps, and so if you were interested in essentially making it regulatory just for this narrow purpose, what we would essentially be saying is those people in that area get the standards we have now, and other people get the relaxed standards, and that we could certainly do that.
Is it easier to do it that way than it would be to do it based on the soils?
I think so, because I don't know enough about soil to know exactly what we would be looking for. I mean, what we use is the NRCS, the federal sort of soils database is how we derive what soil types are on particular pieces of property. So I think we'd be trying to identify, like, which ones of those are more, to me, it seems like there's been this mapping done that has said this is the channel migration zone. They haven't done that for every river, but I think they've done it for the one where they feel like the risk is the highest. And we do have those. So yeah, if you're interested in that, I'd recommend we go with a map-based system.
Okay, just want to throw that out to my colleagues, and maybe, I don't think Commissioner Scholl, I think Commissioner Smith was around back then when we discussed this during points of time in our first term, but this is something that I think we need a briefing, again, just a refresher about that risk we have with those homeowners up there, and Nancy Bush was right on top of that because that was her department, emergency management at the time. I think it might be valuable to, if there's a way to do that unless that's too laborious, but I do want to see at least this, I am in favor of what this is trying to do here, so in general.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm in favor of this too. Believe it or not, I get complaints and calls on this particular issue because of my natural resource background and laws that I passed in the legislature. And this is really a big deal for a lot of people. My questions are, does the 160-acre template test still apply?
Yes.
It does. Now, is there an income test applied to this, or that's only agricultural lands?
Correct.
Correct. I think this is a restoration of private property rights. I think it's very good. We should not be more restrictive than any Senate Bill 100 or any other land use in there. Paul, I understand what you're saying about the soil erosion, especially in those particular areas when, because of high waters, the banks are eroded and eventually the house falls into the river. My concern over that is if we apply a channel migration zone, for instance. I bet you it's going to trigger a lawsuit if somebody's ability to build on that piece of property is taken away because we've applied a more restricted zone than what we're trying to accomplish with this overall bill. I do have heartburn over that. Building in a flood zone is problematic because then it falls back on the county for mitigation. And it's hugely controversial going down that. Maybe we could kick this question back to the Planning Commission. You could take them some information and just let them know what our initial reactions to this, including not only the soil erosion, but the erosion of private property rights on this. And maybe a limitation of, for instance, somebody has 1 acre or 2 acres. Maybe that's not a large enough parcel to build next to a river. Maybe the setbacks need to be furthered, but that's also considered a taking too. Commissioner Savas.
Yeah, I appreciate your comments, and I think the other thing I want to just insert in this conversation for consideration is that this is really it's a life and safety issue. When those rains are torrential and that channel migrates, there's people that were cut off. And I'm just going to share my first business meeting as a commissioner, January of 2011. Our first business was declaring an emergency because Lolo Pass had just blown out the river, or the bridge, and a lot of people were in harm, and they were literally isolated and trapped. And so after being up there, I think the soils there are so unique, and the situation there is so unique. I think a carve-out would be responsible, because we've been asking ourselves since then, and other events, we've asked ourselves, why did we ever allow building homes in this area in the first place? Because of that issue. And so that's a burden on the county, and it's a burden on the area up there, as well as the cost for the wastewater facilities up there that keep on getting destroyed when we have these they're not flooding events, but these channel migration events. Just want to throw that out there for the record.
Yep. Points well noted. Commissioner Fisher.
So question about public input. I know we're having a public hearing, but have these been vetted through like the community planning groups, like the Rhododendron CPO, or have we?
Not yet. So we come to you and to the Planning Commission first in these study session, policy session forums, just to see if you're interested, in moving forward. It is the case with a minor amendment package that we don't have the staffing. We just don't have the resource to do the type of public engagement like you saw maybe on the housing project. But we routinely notify all of our CPOs of code amendments. We give them sort of like detailed explanations of everything that's proposed. So if they wish to weigh in, they can, and they will absolutely have the chance to do that on anything you choose to move forward with.
And you engage PGA to help with communications on that?
Sure.
Okay. That may be a good route. Commissioner Scholl?
There's a difference between the soil productivity type for timber and the soils when it comes to a building permit, because on any given plot plan, there's an analysis of the soil type to determine if it's going to perk, if it's going to be safe to build on, if it's in a known slide area. So that part's already dealt with.
Through a separate avenue, through the building
right.
permit and septic approval process, exactly.
So really, here, when it comes to soil types, we're only looking at the productivity in relation to timber.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you. I think we're going to move on to the next slide. Glenn, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. And the next one is sort of two issues together. The issue here is about non-conforming uses. That's planner speak for a legacy land use that, while maybe isn't allowed in that zone today, is nonetheless legal because the use began prior to restrictive zoning and is never discontinued. Now, state and county law protect these non-conforming uses. We can't just zone somebody and their business closes if it isn't allowed under the new zone. But we have some leeway locally to define what it means for a non-conforming use to discontinue. And once a non-conforming use discontinues, it cannot restart, except in compliance with the rules of today. So right now, we have this discontinuance period for non-conforming uses that's 12 months, 1 year. So if you have a non-conforming restaurant in a residential zone and it stops operating maybe for 12 months, it's questionable of whether or not you can restart. And in the last couple of years and before that, we have heard from members of the public that maybe this 12 months is too short. Indeed, there are other jurisdictions, including Multnomah County, that provide a longer discontinuance period. We're proposing to extend the discontinuance period to 2 years. So essentially, if something comes up and you can't operate your business, you don't necessarily lose the right to conduct it. Now, at the same time, you can alter a non-conforming use. If you have this non-conforming restaurant, you might be able to turn it into, say, a flower shop, even if it's a residential zone. There's some criteria, but you can alter a non-conforming use. If you get approved for that non-conforming use alteration, you have 4 years to implement it. That is, not actually start that new flower shop or construct the building, just get the permits. You have to get the building permits within 4 years of the approval. And that reality creates a little bit of an ambiguity that has been troublesome for some members of the public. So the alteration implementation period is 4 years long, but the discontinuance period is 12 months. And so it sometimes comes up, well, what happens if my non-conforming use discontinues within that 4-year period? It's not a big issue, but it's kind of an important one, and we're trying to relieve regulatory ambiguities. Property owners don't like not knowing what the rules of the game are.
Yes, that's correct.
We're proposing to sync them up. We're proposing to extend the implementation period, or the discontinuance period to 2 years, but shorten the implementation period to 2 years as well. Now, again, the implementation period is just to get the permits to build, if that's what you're going to do. And keep in mind, maybe 2 years isn't enough time for you to get your building permits. You can still qualify for 1 2-year time extension. So that's the proposal.
Okay.
And interested what your questions are.
I like that one. I'm going through the notes. Commissioners, any questions on that? Okay. Thank you, Commissioners. Glenn, number 4, please.
Very good. And the next one is about work in public rights-of-way or public utility easements. So it's the case right now under the zoning code that if somebody, say a governmental agency, wanted to do a project inside of an existing public road right-of-way or public utility easement, the zoning code requires, and if that project requires a land use application from our office, the zoning code requires that the owner of the subject property underlying that easement or right-of-way sign the application, even if that public right-of-way is existing or that public utility easement would be for the particular type of project that is being proposed. Recently, we have heard that this is troublesome, that a public works project, for example, could be stymied by one property owner not wanting to give their signature on a project in a public right-of-way that would otherwise be allowed. And in particular, this Bull Run facility with the Portland Water Bureau, if they were to run infrastructure in an existing road right-of-way, it may require the signatures of all of the individual underlying property owners. Other jurisdictions don't necessarily have this requirement. County Council has showed us that there are other jurisdictions in Oregon that don't require the signature of the underlying property owner if it's a governmental agency, and again, entirely inside of an existing right-of-way or public utility easement. Anything else you want to add on that?
Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay. Commissioner Savas?
Would that apply to, I mean, I'm assuming that applies to a property in which the easement is in the title, spelled in the title, correct?
If the easement is recorded with the deed to the subject property, that easement might be literally for a public utility and grant the easement holder certain rights to use it, but yet we still require the underlying property owner's signature.
There'd have to be some kind of documentation, yes, whether it would be, I mean, it would pull in a title report, it should, if it's a recorded easement, yes.
Right, so I know there's different types of easements on properties, private properties, for example, for utilities and so forth, and some basically very, very, very limited, where it just gives maybe access, so on. So is there, probably, there's no distinction in that necessarily, right, is what you're saying. There's no distinction about all those different types of easements.
We would
It's just really you're saying blanket, a blanket authority not to require a signature by the property owner.
I think we're saying it would be limited. So for instance, if I had an access easement across Glenn's property, this wouldn't be covered by that. We would still, that's essentially a private easement, if you will, between the two of us, and he would need to sign if I was proposing to do some land use on his property that happened to be in my easement. This would be public utility easements and dedicated rights-of-way, which it's, a lot of people, I didn't know this, probably for years after working here, that your deed typically reads to the center line of the road unless it's a state highway. So technically, there's an underlying owner for all of our public roads that's not the county, or most of them. So that can really, often it's not an issue because a lot of things that go on in rights-of-way don't need land use. Lots of things that go on in public utility easements don't require a land use permit. So it doesn't come up very often, but recently there's just been this little flurry where it's been a question several times. And so that's why this is coming before you. But it would be narrow, I guess, is what I'm getting at. It wouldn't be every easement. And as Glenn said, there is this Portland Water Bureau project that I know you're all aware of where this has been raised, but it's also come up in a couple of smaller contexts.
If I can just add, we're not proposing to remove any public notice or appeal process. So if there's a land use application in an adjacent right-of-way or public utility easement, the property owner nearby and those around it will still get notice of the application, be given an opportunity to comment and an opportunity for appeal. It's just who can initiate the request is sort of what we're proposing to tweak.
Okay. Commissioner Savas?
Yeah, thank you.
All righty. Commissioner Fisher?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to put my head around this as to when this would be functional. And then so I just wonder, so say I know someone who has, the fiber that goes across her house was built on fiber. And what if it's built on it? I mean, it's over the fiber. So what if something had to be changed with that? Would she just have no ability to stop anything, or just you go through the land? I mean, what would be the process in a
Right.
situation like that?
I mean, I think there, and maybe Mr. Madcore will want to chime in here, because when we get into this question of, sort of what her rights are as the underlying owner versus the easement holder, can they make or move her structure? Whose responsibility is it? Did she build it in the wrong place? Did she buy something she shouldn't have? I mean, I don't know. We would not be involved in those issues. This sort of issue of, oh, they're coming to put a utility line in and I think they're trespassing, isn't something that land use would be involved with. We're really only going to be involved in the question of, does PGE have permission to file for a land use permit? That doesn't really mean they get to go construct whatever it is. The person could still potentially claim trespass or work it out with them as, you're going to demo my house. I mean, they're going to have legal avenues for that. But this is really pretty narrow. Just the question of, can they come in and apply for can PGE apply for the conditional use permit instead of Jennifer Hughes having to sign it if the easement's on my land?
So it's just to make it simpler for the utility? Is that all this is?
Yes.
How do other jurisdictions do it?
Yeah, County Council was able to identify a number of other jurisdictions in Oregon. I can think of the city of Eugene, just off the top of my head, that they require the property owner's signature, except when it is a governmental body for a project in public rights-of-way, for example.
I mean, it just seems like it would feel wrong if you had a property that had an easement and you weren't informed, and some government entity went and initiated something and you just didn't even know. I mean, it just seems like it feels wrong for whatever reason.
Yeah, you've identified the policy question, right?
Actually,
It's
that
this.
happened to me on a piece of property that I owned. It did. In fact, and then I ended up having to deed the rights. It was a legal mess. They just came in, went over a corner of I says, what are you people doing? And I had had it recently surveyed. Yes, this is a problem. I can tell you
I mean, we
that.
would be asking for proof of the easement, of course, and notifying the property owner. So if they believed there wasn't an easement, they could certainly say there isn't one. That would play out as part of the land use application. And I think the argument for it is that significant public infrastructure could be held up potentially because of somebody dragging their feet on signing an application that ultimately they'll probably have to consent to because of the terms of the easement, but it creates kind of a sticky wicket for people.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner
Yeah.
Savas?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to understand where and how this is a problem. So for example, years ago, a development was done down the street from my property, and the developer's required to make an improvement. So they used the easement, and they dug up the front of my property, and they laid a pipeline down and did all that. I never signed anything. I never contested it. No, that was fine. So no signature was required then, or should there have been a signature? Or where does this apply? Why is my situation unique to, or how are those other situations unique that don't?
It's relatively rare that a signature would be required because most of the utility infrastructure, particularly in rights of way, is just allowed. It doesn't require a conditional use permit or anything special. Or they're getting permission to build the utilities as part of another application, like a subdivision or something, and then the utility part just kind of gets worked out as part of all of that. The most likely situation is in the natural resource zones that are regulated by the state. They've got some provisions that pertain specifically to utilities. And the one that comes to mind is in exclusive farm use zones. They have limits. They restrict even just the running of utility lines. And I think it's the idea of, you're going to carve up this farmland by running some kind of a utility line, across a whole bunch of productive ag land. So it does require land use for a lot of utility infrastructure in the EFU zone. And it depends on what type of utility infrastructure and where they're putting it as to what that process is. But that's where we're most likely to see the need for a signature.
Okay, so least likely in an urban setting.
Correct,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Yeah. Okay, any more questions on this particular number 4? Then go ahead with number 5. And I
Sure.
have a lot of,
Frankly, it's a little surreal to talk about this with you. It's such a niche issue. It feels weird, but I'm excited. Yeah, and what the issue is, I would say at its heart, is the criteria that we use to determine whether a given unit of land is separately developable from something else. Can I put a house on these 5 acres or not? We're proposing to modify that criteria that's embedded in a definition to expand property owner rights, by and large, with one little exception that I'll explain. We're also hopeful that by making this change that we're going to streamline some things that are particularly burdensome for prospective developers, hopefully make some things a little bit fairer, and ultimately there may be more properties that could qualify for development because of this. But again, we cannot quantify exactly how much. I would suggest, though, that most of this would be in rural areas where this would play out. So just a reminder that there's all sorts of ways you could refer to a unit of land, depending on the reason. You all have heard of tax lots for tax assessment purposes. There's this thing called a discrete parcel that talks about ownership. We, in the planning world, use this term lot of record to refer to a unit of land for development purposes. So we're always asking, is this piece a lot of record? Now, importantly, these things are not always the same. In fact, a lot of people look at tax maps, such as this example, and they might call our office and ask, is my tax lot able to have a house on it? Well, we have to figure out, is that tax lot a lot of record? Like this donut-shaped piece, tax lot 800, is it a lot of record that can have its own house? What about tax lot 803, the donut hole in the middle? Is that a separate lot of record that can have its own house? Or are the two combined as one lot of record and the whole piece just gets one house? There are other examples that I could just illustrate, but this is a really common task that we have to do, and it's particularly burdensome because of the existing definition. And I'm not going to read you the whole definition unless you want me to, but the provision that we're proposing to change is what I'm going to refer to as this lot consolidation provision, where a given property is a lot of record if it was on a separate deed the very first time the county ever zoned it. Maybe I'll just say in 1980. It had no land use regulations before that. The county zoned it in 1980. If that property was on a separate deed, it is a lot of record, even if it was smaller than that zone's minimum lot size would have allowed for newly created parcels after that. If there's an adjacent piece on a separate deed that I also owned that was smaller than the minimum lot size that applied at first zoning, they get combined as one lot of record. So I might have always had two separately deeded adjacent pieces, but I might only get one house because I own both at the date that it was first zoned. The reason why this might be unfair is it's just about who owned them, whose names were on the paperwork decades ago. And so if I owned one piece and my spouse and I owned together an adjacent piece, even if that adjacent piece was smaller than the minimum lot size of first zoning, they're separate lots, and we would get two houses today. But if I owned both and my name was only on that deed, all circumstances being the same, I might only get one house. So there's this fairness question, and this provision, this lot consolidation provision, because of what we have to look at, takes a lot of time. We have to research the entire ownership history of all adjacent properties, and you could imagine how over the decades the records get a little confusing. So it's a significant amount of work that staff need to do in order to evaluate whether a given property qualifies for some new development. So in this proposal, we're proposing to remove this lot consolidation provision, where if you had a separately deeded piece, even if you own one next to it, they're separate lots of record. This is the way every other jurisdiction that I've been able to look at does it. Clackamas County, so far that I found, is the only one that has this lot consolidation provision. Now, there might be good reasons for it, but it means potentially that somebody cannot develop a given unit of land simply because of who owned what some decades ago. We cannot quantify how many properties would become lots of record if we remove this provision, but we know that more of them would, and probably mostly in rural areas. I just wanted to say one point on this other element of the definition that we're proposing to change, essentially to sunset for particular reasons. And that particular reason is we're not entirely sure it's consistent with state law. But basically, if a given unit of land is foreclosed on pursuant to some state laws, we can consider it a lot of record. The reason why that may not be consistent with state law is we may not have the authority to do that. Nonetheless, it's in the code, and we don't have to sunset this allowance, but we're proposing to. So the question is whether to modify the lot of record definition, and why we might do that is for all these reasons. I don't want to overstate staff's concern about the workload. We'll continue to do it. We just know that people's development opportunities are often on hold for weeks until we're able to unwind this ownership history of adjacent parcels. So we're curious to see if there would be support of modifying it to remove this lot consolidation provision and sunset the foreclosure provision, or can continue to do what we're doing
Well,
right now.
I am wholly in support of this. This is my Waterloo, commissioners. Seriously, seriously.
It's your what again?
I know many
Problem for you.
landowners, including myself, who've been denied development rights because the county decided to consolidate lots. And it's very problematic. What I want to know, we're going to, today's date moving forward, how are you going to fix the harm inflicted on this of decisions that were made decades ago?
Well, of course, we can't. At
Sure
least
you
there's
can.
no way I know of. That
Well,
essentially
okay,
from
now, Jennifer.
this point forward, they would have it.
Yes, I understand what you're saying on this. So you have a separate deed. You have a separate tax lot record. And in definition, lot of record is you have a deed for each piece of property.
Yes, that's true if it was, well, if you get rid of the lot consolidation piece and if they were deeded prior to first zoning. If they were deeded after first zoning, then the question is, did they comply with the zoning requirements? So if somebody came in today, let's say in a 5-acre zone, and they just went out and deeded themselves 5 1-acre parcels, those wouldn't be.
So I'm talking about prior to zoning. For instance,
Yes,
the
correct.
1970s was a pivotal time in Clackamas County when mid-1970s, and it was probably before you were there. I know that because my dad is old and he remembers his stuff. Likewise, other property owners in rural parts of Clackamas County were denied their right to build, for instance, on the farm. And it has to do with farm succession. And that's an issue in the county, commissioners. It really is. So you have a property, for instance, you have a 75-acre parcel. And for whatever reason, over time, before zoning, contiguous to it is a strip of land that's 10 acres, separate deed, same ownerships. The younger generation wants to come in, build a house next to it, take over the farming practices, but they still want mom and dad to live on the original property until they're no longer alive. And so this has happened a lot, really, in Clackamas County. So I think there should be a remedy in place also of people who have been denied applications to build because your county planner said, I was subject to this. Well, here's a deed for this property, here's a deed for this property. No, we're not going to do that because we combined them. I think there needs to be a remedy for that as well.
So I don't know how we would codify that exactly. The way this would work is the definition changes, let's say, as of, November 15th or whatever it is. And from that point forward, the answer would be yes, they are separate lots of record in the scenario that we've explained. But we can't go back and say, oh, well, in 1972, under this definition, they would have been a lot of record, and therefore you would have been able to do something back then. I mean, they're still going to be subject to whatever the building rules are now. So if you're in like a rural residential district, it means you can have a house on that other lot. Say you're in RFFI, for example. If you're in an EFU zone, it at least opens the door for the potential for a dwelling. But then we still have the state rules that require either the income test or that, all the things that you're familiar with will
Yes.
still apply to that parcel. So it's really just the first step.
So when I was in the legislature, I changed the income test rule. And what that said is the income test only applies if the farms in the area are making the income that applied in the test. And for instance, and this is wholly onerous, in the early 2000s, the income test rule was $80,000 a year of gross income on your farm. I'm going to tell you, if that happened, all farmers in Oregon would be multimillionaires. Okay? It is very difficult, very difficult. So it changed. I was able to change it. Governor Kitzhaber signed it into law that says, on the income test rule, what was the aggregate income, for instance, in the past 5 years? It's number one. Number two was soil conditions. And number three was, what is the actual income of the adjacent farms in the area within how many miles? And so that was wholly onerous too. Nothing to do with the county. But what I'm saying is, a lot of these rules were put into place. Why? We don't know. Why people were denied lots of record. They were combined. But I am thankful for this going forward. I'm wholly supportive of this. I'm just a little bit testy on this issue. We have several commissioners. Commissioner Schrader, you were in first.
Just from this gave me deja vu about Measure 50, because I remember at the time we were making decisions after that measure passed, that actually depended on deeds and lot of record.
Some of it did, right, in terms of
Yeah.
whether they qualified, what sort
Right.
of,
Yeah, I
yes,
remember that.
prior development rights that they would be entitled to under the claims that
If
they
there
were
was,
filing.
if there was a continuing ownership.
Correct, yes, yes, and of course that, they processed all the previously filed claims, but then sort of closed the door, right, with
Yeah.
Measure 49, where
Right,
there's no
right.
more, other than if we
rescinded.
adopt something new and restrictive. But yeah, you're right.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Savas or Commissioner Shaw, who's next? I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Sorry, Paul. I wasn't sure who got
Yeah,
his
this
name.
sounds like a good idea, modifying the definition of the lot of record and removing the consolidation provision. And I think this is going to stimulate potential for new homes and improve property owner rights. On Commissioner Smith's question about issues from the past, this will have a public hearing, and in the process, people who in the past maybe were denied the potential to build a home will be able to reassess, and maybe they can do it now, right? Do you have any idea how many potential, I know that's a big question, isn't it?
No, I would love it if we could.
Yeah.
There's just, I could go on and on why
Sure.
that's
Yeah.
impossible.
I
but,
understand. Okay, but the deal is, in this process, there's going to be outreach. It's going to be made available to the public to know about, and so they'll have the potential to reapply. So this is a very good thing. Thank you.
Very good thing. I agree, Commissioner Scholl. Commissioner Savas, you're up.
Yeah, so I'm not as concerned about this, but from a retroactive standpoint, I think that's where I really have concerns a little bit. I'm almost reluctant to actually raise this, but I'm going to. And I don't know that I could actually say that in a situation that someone was denied their ability to build on a lot, but they were encouraged to combine them. I don't know, I can't remember exactly. And because of that, I was looking at purchasing a piece of property, and actually possibly still could. But the complication was that 3 lots were combined into one. And I don't know exactly the circumstances of it. They were encouraged to do that. And now they have regret of those 3 separate lots being combined because of another entanglement, which is far more complicated than we got time to talk about. So my question is, I can look at that a little bit deeper, but in saying so, should I almost declare not a conflict of interest, but so to speak? I mean, I'm just really wondering what our vulnerability is as decision makers. You know, I'm only contemplating, but I could benefit by that, if you will. So what are we subject to from a standpoint of declaring conflicts of interest if such a thing exists? In the retroactive standpoint.
Conflicts are personal to the commissioner, and if you were to benefit, if you had in a pre-existing, if you owned a lot of record that was merged and you would financially gain from your decision today, that would be likely an actual conflict of interest, and you would abstain from the conversation and/or the vote. If you're talking about buying a piece of property, it's speculative. That transaction might not go through. It would be a potential conflict, which would allow you to participate in the conversation, provided you disclose a potential conflict, and you could vote on it as well.
Okay. Yeah, I would just say that in this particular property or application is that the ability to develop the property changes significantly because of this action that took place where it combined the 3 lots together. Whereas if that was undone, it opens up potential opportunity. So.
And so with any specific circumstance, I would just counsel you and any other potential customer to check with us, because this resolves one circumstance where things are not separate lots of record. There are certainly other reasons based on whether they really ever were separately deeded. When did that happen? Did they combine them to do like a farm management plan, not probably in this case, but to build a house? So there's still a lot of other things people need to take into account. But this is relatively common, actually, that we see this where they were separately deeded and were combined at first zoning.
It is fairly common in our rural areas. I understand Commissioner Savas's question on that. I think, as attorney says, potential versus actual. It's probably just a potential, but I'm not a lawyer. Holy cow, thankfully. Any other questions or concerns?
No, other than to say, if we move forward on something retroactive, then I guess then we all ought to be considerate of that. I will be declaring a conflict.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions on this? I'm wholly in support of really the entire package. I think it's very good. I think a lot of thought and consideration has gone into this. I think you've listened to a lot of constituents in the county, a lot of folks out there. And boy, you know, some of this stuff, if Clackamas County is the only one who did lot consolidation. That is an issue. I'm glad we're not doing that anymore soon. So when, after we do this today, when does it go to the Planning Commission?
So we don't have hearing dates yet, and I don't know, I'll look at Administrator Schmidt, do we want a formal motion? I mean, what I heard was you all seem comfortable with moving forward, but we probably may want
Yes,
to.
if the board would make a motion, it's option 2 in the staff report, correct?
Okay.
Jennifer?
Yep, that's what I wanted to
Option 2?
Yeah.
Glenn?
Glenn's going to
Commissioner,
check, I think that's right,
Schall, go
yes.
ahead, please.
Wait, Joanne,
Believe
second,
it's
please.
option
Yes.
two.
Is it Option 1 or
I-
option 2?
One second.
I support all 5 of these ZDO amendments, but I note that the Planning Commission recommended disapproval of number 2, aligning the county's requirements for the forest template dwelling issue. So I respect their recommendations and their concerns, but in this particular case, I recommend that I would recommend approval of all 5.
You've made a motion, Commissioner Scholl.
I'll second that motion.
Commissioner Scholl has made a motion approval of all 5 of these considerations. Commissioner Schrader has seconded that motion. Now, this action today refers the ongoing consideration by the Planning Commission, just for a point of clarification. We
Correct.
have not passed this into law. I
That's
just
correct,
want to
yep.
be clear on that. Stephen, is the motion okay?
Motion is fine, Chair.
Okay. We have a couple of comments before we take a vote. Commissioner Scholl?
I just want to say this is a good day for property owners in Clackamas County.
I would agree. Commissioner Fisher?
I think you answered my question, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding our process. So this just sends everything to the Planning Commission, and they will have input. You are recommending that the second option, or what did you call it? Second subject regarding the forest lands and the
Correct.
template and all of that, not go to the Planning Commission?
No, we are. We're recommending option 2, which is all 5. The Planning Commission was not, they didn't take a formal vote. They were not in support of the template test, the forest dwelling, the reduction in the standards, because of the items, wildfire and development in rural areas. Staff's recommending that we go ahead and move forward with a public hearing because it allows both the Planning Commission and you to hear from the public.
Right.
And I think that can just inform the decision, and you don't have to adopt it in the end.
Okay, that clarifies for me. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Any other comments on this?
Real good.
Okay, Tony, would you please take the poll?
Commissioner Fisher,
Aye.
Commissioner Scholl,
Aye.
Commissioner Savas,
Aye.
Commissioner Schrader,
Aye.
Chair Smith.
Aye, motion passes 5-0. Thank you very much. Thank you, staff, for your very good work. Thanks to the Planning Commission for their input and everybody involved in this. This is a very heavy lift. We're most appreciative. Seeing no further business before the board, we are adjourned.
Thank you all.